Alright, so it's been probably a couple of months since I did one of these, and given the holiday that just passed, I figured why not start up again with romance movies. And in this particular case, as you can probably see, there is really pretty much since the dawn of romance movies, there's been sort of a subside to that genre, which is the story of guy meets girl and guy and girl fall in love, and then girl gets sick and dies. It's like it might as well be its own genre apart from the romance genre itself at this point. And these are two relatively high up examples, I would think, of those two, especially the one actually called Love Story being one of the more popular and more or less beloved. I think it's maybe got a bit of a reputation now for being a tad dated in some cases, but it also still has a very strong fan base as well. And I figure we'll go ahead and start with it. And the interesting thing that you'll notice about both of these movies also is that they seemingly both come from novels. Obviously, Walk to Remember being from Nicholas Sparks, and this one was actually a bit of a different case, where it's to my understanding that the novel of this movie was a marketing tactic more than anything else, where the screenwriter actually wrote the script for this, and they had intended to make it, but they wanted to drum up business, so they were like, why don't you adapt your script into a book, and then we'll sell the book first. And then the book became like a massive hit, and then they built on that hype by then making and releasing the movie afterwards. Which is really interesting because if you go into that not knowing it, it very much does come off like a movie that's based on a novel, because there's so much sort of background that's only somewhat touched on, and it feels like there's so many more things you could go into. Though, weirdly enough, it is, to my understanding, obviously the book was a massive hit, that's how we end up with the movie, but also, I've actually heard quite a few people say, I haven't read the book myself, either one, but some of the things I've heard also were that the book is very, like, I guess, bland, to where it's like, it's the two, but it almost feels like the movie is able to improve on that stuff even more when you'd think it would be the reverse, where the novel would have more meat to it. But I've heard both positive and the negatives about the book itself. So when we go into this one, obviously one of the first cliches awaiting us, and that's not to say, for a genre like the romance movie, it really just kind of depends on how it hits you, and the characters in it play a huge part in it. So when you have, cliches in the story, that's not necessarily a criticism all the time. Like, it could be there and be a familiar thing, but if the two characters involved are two characters that you are invested in, then they could work and build off of the cliches, even if they're there. But the weird case about this is that, one of the cliche we start off with is the fact that they hate each other at first sight, pretty much, because of where they come from. And when we see them together for the first time, they're, like, already in mid-fight. There's, like, the fight kind of started within the dissolve that was going into the following scene. And then from that point on, it's pretty much instantaneous and goes in the directions you would expect it to, where they hate each other, but then, like, the more they bicker back and forth, the more they end up falling in love. But the trouble with that here, I think, is that the entire first half of this movie, to me, has always felt like it's, like, constantly moving and fast forward. And I think that kind of starts off giving it a bit of trouble of finding that investment in them that we were talking about, that you need to get past some of the more familiar beats. That's not to say there's not stuff in here that does back them up quite nicely and does give us enough of the showing the feelings between them to where when we get to sort of the second half and the big emotional payoffs really start to happen, that there is still something there. But the interesting thing that the movie does is mostly does these things visually rather than through a lot of dialogue. like there are a couple of moments when, and it almost somewhat, if you kind of want to reach a little bit, sort of foreshadows how Oliver is eventually going to feel about her once he realizes, once she's been diagnosed towards the end, and it's that feeling of I mean they're in love through the whole movie, but it's still kind of you still maybe don't quite know how good it is until it's gone. And we get a couple of doses of that in the beginning when he's at the hockey game and he gets put in the penalty box and she's down there talking to him and he kind of just, shoos her away and it seems like he's annoyed with her being there. And then there's that, after she's gone, he has that look back, like he wishes in that moment that she was still there anyway. And then there is, and to the point that's the point of that is driven home even further by the fact that it's that night, after just that one look where he looks back and sees that she has gone back up to her seat, that he ends up professing his love to her, like that night. And then that's kind of comes into play in the bigger scene later when they're fighting, and then after, because he won't talk to his dad for the 60th birthday party, and she ends up storming out. And while this was a big fight that he was clearly extremely angry over in the moment, as soon as she walks out the door and storms out, there's like immediate remorse when he like turns around, and then he spends the whole day and night around town looking for her. And so I feel like those scenes kind of not only mirror each other well in regards to showing how he feels about her without having to have him like constantly profess it, because obviously that would kill the impact pretty quickly if that were the case. But as far as dialogue goes, there are some lines in here, one of which in particular is one of the most famous movie lines in history, and I believe also the tagline of the movie. And this is where you kind of get a bit of, some people think it has a bit of a dated feel, given how you, I would say, interpret this line. I mean, it is pretty straightforward, but I do feel like it's said in two different contexts, in this scene and then the very end with his dad. But, and I feel like you get, it feels more literal the first time, the really famous time that it's used. And there is a lot of, like, backlash now against the line, "Love means everyone to say you're sorry," because you can see where this would be kind of an issue, because it's like, I've heard a retort a lot where a lot of people say that the line should be, "Love means having the guts to say you're sorry," which is the exact opposite, but much more fitting. And yeah, it does seem like it would be almost probably unhealthy for a relationship to live by that creed, but at the same time, I do think there is, like I said, I feel like in this moment especially, they do mean it pretty literally, but I do think if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, it could be a roundabout way of saying, "I'll always forgive you," which is much more like, when you put that meaning behind it, then it makes a little more sense. But like I said, I think that comes through a lot more when he says it to his dad rather than when she says it to him, because then it's the whole thing of, people get that vibe that it means we can be shitty to each other all we want, and because we love each other, we don't have to, deal with the consequences of how the other feels about that. It's kind of it sets up a whole messy sort of thing. But like I said, if the idea was along the lines of, like, forgiveness, I can see it, but it's weird. It's weird to me that it's still, in like many circles, regarded as one of the like top movie quotes of all time, and it hasn't entirely suffered from the from time and people realizing, like, well, that's just not good advice at all. That is terrible for a relationship. But yeah, I do feel like there's another meaning in there if you can find it, even if the context don't always line up with that. And talking about that also, the way they are with each other in this relationship, there is a lot of because we start off with the whole thing when they have the playful banter and they're always, like, taking jabs at each other and where they come from. But there's always that, nature to it, that it comes from a loving place or whatever. And it's like it's one of those cases where every time it seems like every time they speak to each other, their sentences are always punctuated with either like "damn" or "goddamn." It's like literal punctuation, like at the end of every sentence. And then there's the moment where towards in about in like the hour in area when she's with the children, and she just straight up tells one of the kids not to bullshit her to his face. It's like the dialogue like that does feel a bit forced, and it's yeah, and it's I don't know, but what I'm saying is the dialogue does not always work, and I think that's probably the main case of when people tend to say that the people that argue that the movie's dated at this point. But I still think, as far as the emotion goes, that's kind of a whole other thing that's separate. I know it probably sounds a bit weird, given that it has one of the most famous lines in movie history, to separate the dialogue from what actually makes it good. But there is something about the kind of the style that it's made where I was talking about, where the stronger points are when they show the emotion without really saying anything. And there's some moments in here also when they use like sort of visual clues that tell the story better than any dialogue could. Like the first time that she says that she loves him back, and we get that cut of him falling back into the snow, and it's like that's the start of a scene where they're just making snow angels, but to cut it right after she says that to kind of show his reaction in that way of just falling backwards is really well done. And then sometimes that's used for comedic purposes, like when they go to see his parents, and he says they get there and immediately they sit down, and he says, "Well, we probably need to get going soon," and then it just cuts and they're driving away, and of course there is because this just had another they put it in theaters for a couple of days for the anniversary, and I saw it, and that got a good laugh in the theater, despite the fact that that's not actually the way it plays out, where it's cutting back and forth between the drive home, and then it turns out they stayed longer than that. We're just cutting back and forth between that and the drive home, but that first cut gives off this really comedic, almost over the top vibe in this kind of story of them leaving immediately. So that's the stuff like that I think works really well. And talking about their parents, Ray Milland, who plays Oliver's dad, who you might know from winning an Oscar for The Lost Weekend, among other things, and he is like really great in this, and he's another case of his best moments are when he's not saying anything or he's hardly saying anything at all. Like that first glimpse we get of him from across the hockey rink when he sees him, and there's like just so much said between them just by their looks, that it almost feels like overkill when they have the scene of dialogue afterwards outside. But still, those scenes really work well, and like I said, I do think the famous line is used even better between the two of them rather than the two of them. And so on the other side of this, it gets a little weird when you go into like the Oscar history, because this obviously was big enough that it got just a movie like this, just a small love story like this, managed to get 7 Oscar nominations, most of which were the big ones: picture, director, actor, actress, supporting actor, screenplay. Its win was score, but we'll go into that in a second. But the thing I wanted to acknowledge here was John Marley, who is famous, who would be famous 2 years later for playing Waltz in The Godfather, the guy that ends up with the horse head in his bed, plays her dad, and he is the one that scored the supporting actor nomination. And there is a lot of good stuff that he does here, particularly the interaction when we first see him between the two of them, and the way he plays off Oliver, and then the way the two of them play off each other, and how she calls him by his first name and stuff like that. There's like a real lived-in relationship between the two of them the first time we see them together, not just based on some earlier scenes where he's kind of built up, but when we actually see them together, works really well in that way also. But and he's really strong in those last couple of scenes when they're in the hospital. Like those are easily his strongest scenes, and probably what secured the nomination for him. but it is pretty bizarre to me in retrospect that Ray Moran was not the one that ended up in that supporting actor slot. Because I feel like the scenes between Oliver's dad and him are significantly stronger, but that's not to say they're anything against the Marley scenes, but I just think the Moran scenes are much stronger, and their relationship is much more sort of... But it is an interesting contrast, though, to see how like kind of estranged they are versus how close she and Marley are. There is something there, but I do think as far as like the dramatics of all of it go, that the Milan scenes really did a lot more. Despite the fact that Marley kind of has the much more, you know, is going to be hit the most by the events of the last 10 minutes or so. But yeah, those scenes are surprisingly. I mean, you almost want to admire that they're not like over the top and like over emotional. They kind of hit that note just right, and I think that's what is makes this hit harder than the tear jerkers that are known for like really going for it. Where this one is actually kind of quite downplayed by comparison anyway. So there is that. So, and talking about whether you're going to downplay it or not does fall into the Oscar-winning score. And there's really two things about this score that stand out, because there's obviously the theme, just the main theme that's instantly recognizable, one of those instantly recognizable themes. And then you also have stuff that they do that really seems kind of simple on the when you're just kind of looking at it at the surface level. When after he learns that she's been diagnosed, but she doesn't know yet, and so there's that scene where we're just watching him walk from the doctor's office to home, and he knows and she doesn't, and there's just that like ominous chord where it's like it's the score as we've known it throughout, as they've been falling in love and all that, and it's like being overpowered. It's playing, but it's being overpowered by this chord playing over it, and it's like really kind of shows how the happy place that they're in is being beaten down by this news that he just got. So that's about the extent of how I took the score, apart from the fact that it's just being recognizable alone makes it stand out when it could have just been some generic bullshit or whatever. I do think it suffers a little bit, and I don't even know if this is necessarily a dated quality. It's just there's just so many movies like this. So many movies came before it that were like it, and many movies have come after it that are similar to it as well, one of which we're getting ready to talk about, of course. To where when we get... If there's one moment in all these movies where two people fall in love and then one of them ends up getting fatally sick, if there is one scene apart from the obvious, initial chemistry scenes between them that should really, really hit, no matter how much of a cliche it is or no matter how many times you've seen it, it would be the scene where they find out the character's going to die. Or the character's sick, at least. And that scene for me in this never, hits on that level. And I don't know if it's because... I mean, obviously there's always the case of you just know the story. But like I said, if a story like this is effective enough, that moment shouldn't lose its power in any context. Or you should at least feel a little bit of something. But it's sort of... And once again, if you want to commend it for being very non-dramatic about it, where it does almost... It's so straightforward and sudden and blunt about the way it happens, the way the doctor just tells him, is it gives us kind of the feel of like Oliver hearing it, where there's no real, dramatic music, there's no dramatic build-up. It's just you walk in the doctor's office and they just say it with no fanfare. And so, like I said, that in itself is commendable that they did the scene that way. But me, personally, I never really get that feeling that you get when you, like I said, should always be there regardless of how old the movie gets or how many times you see the story or whatever, or how much you're expecting it. But it's just kind of, there's just never really been much of an impact to that to me, but that could be a me problem, I don't know, but it does reach those moments later, like in around the time he lays in bed with her is when it starts to get to me. And I know that's like really, really late. That's like one of the last moments. That's like one of the last moments they have together, if not the last. But it does get there still. And sometimes there's moments that get to me in this that I don't even think are there to get you. Like the fact that this is all, because my favorite time of year easily is just like the whole Christmas area where like the decorations are out and everybody's, behaves a little differently if you're in the right circles, a little happier and more generous or whatever. And it's just this time of year that's like really sacred to me and so many people. And the fact that this is all happening in that time frame is like, because it's like this terrible, heartbreaking thing is happening. These people are about to lose this person that they love at such a young age, and are so blindsided by this. And these Christmas decorations are up in the hospital. And it's like when you just see like that little Christmas tree there, or those little paper wreaths on the door, it's like just a knife twisting that makes it even more heartbreaking that that's the setting this is all happening in. So once again, maybe that's just a personal thing. I don't know, but and then that final shot. It's my understanding that I don't know if it was the studio or what. Somebody wanted like kind of like an epilogue. And I want to say it was the director that stepped in and said, no, the last shot is Oliver sitting alone, and that's it, and just credits over it. Which is really powerful because it's like it forces you to confront the tragedy of it, when like doesn't let it you get away from it, because it, like I said, it all, much like when somebody gets progressively sick, sometimes it can be like really dragged out, and then there's other times where it happens like way too fast. I mean, probably better for them because of the lack of suffering, but as far as like the grieving goes, like it's just it feels like you barely have time to react, and you learn a person's sick and then they're gone already. And it's like the way the movie kind of does that, the sort of blindsiding thing, where we're hit with it so non-ceremoniously, and then she's gone, and then we're just faced with credits, just seemingly all very quickly. And that in itself, and that might sound like, for somebody looking for something more dramatic, that might not, appease that, but as far as like going for real emotion and something that's just gonna hit you like that, like it would for real in a way, that I feel like that was a really good way to go, and kind of in the way that it doesn't feel like it copped out to anything. And it's stuff like that that kind of makes it rise above stuff like cliches, that, as we talked about in the genre, are just inevitable, and it's just a matter of how they handle that and how you feel about the characters. And yeah, so they aren't two characters like I was talking about at the beginning, and the way they handle all that stuff, and how it feels like the movie's in fast forward for the first half. I think a lot of it also, in regards to me not feeling that impact right away, when it happens, is that these are two characters I've never been that attached to, regardless of I've seen the movie probably 3 times, including that time in the theater just this past week. And yeah, but the fact that it does, even if I personally am not hit by it right away, the fact that it does eventually get there is more than enough, for me. So the scene also when she kind of, just mentions to him, kind of pretty indirectly, that she already knows, and it's not something he has to keep from her, and that she doesn't want to bullshit around with it, and they're just kind of sitting together. It's the stuff like that, the stuff that's just not dramatic at all, I think, weirdly enough, is what ends up making it as dramatic as it ultimately is. So yeah, so I can see how it can be a mixed bag for some people, but I can also see where the classic status comes from, to an extent. But like I said, it's hardly the movie's fault that we've had, oh God, what is it, 50 plus years of a lot of movies that are very similar to it, regardless of the stuff that came before it. It's the stuff after that's probably going to downplay its impact much more. So, especially the more modern movies that have the same sort of layout, so, and the same sort of beats. But while we're on that topic, I suppose we can go into A Walk to Remember, and once again, same very familiar setup. But there is something about I don't know too much about the history of Love Story's author, Eric Siegel, but going into A Walk to Remember, it is worth noting that what's interesting about A Walk to Remember, first off, is that Nicholas Sparks has a certain reputation and certain stories that people immediately associate with him. And I would think the sort of ultimate Nicholas Sparks thing, whether it be one of his books or movies, is The Notebook. And that's kind of the thing you go to, and it's like the sort of like almost gold standard that he set. It almost makes you forget that, as far as his movie adaptations go, that The Notebook was the third one. And it's like, despite The Notebook's like up here status, it almost feels like it'd be a first one. But before it, I think the first adaptation of one of his stuff was Message in a Bottle. Um, and then the second one was this. A Walk to Remember is pre The Notebook. And the thing about that also is it feels... Because when it comes to Nicholas Sparks, it's very, very easy to be cynical. I have so many times that I've lost count. But this story in particular, I think, is a little different because the personal connection, where the character of Jamie is based on his sister. And so you kind of feel like you can look at the rest of his stories and come from a cynical place and say, that's just his formula. It's the love story, and then just from out of nowhere, most of the time, somebody will either be sick and die, or just straight up die. And when you get used to that formula, it can be like it becomes a game. Like, you watch a movie based on Nicholas Sparks' book, and you wait for which character is going to die and how. And that's just what you do. But the fact that this story, it comes from that really personal place, yeah, it sobers you up real quick as far as seeing it as like a really... The impact is much harder when you know how much of a personal place it comes from. And your cynical side, I would hope, kind of takes a back seat, for, at least for this one. Because you can really feel... Because there is something... Because I didn't know that the first time I saw this movie, but I remember the first time I saw it, it did feel like there was something different. Like, it didn't feel quite as... Like, it felt more impactful. Because I do like The Notebook quite a bit also. But this one almost felt impactful in a different way, despite the fact the way it sets itself up is like a normal teen movie. Because the really interesting thing here is that... I mean, I guess one way you can look at it as it almost feels like another teen movie is, I guess, the director. Because where we had Arthur Hiller getting a Best Director nomination for Love Story... A Walk to Remember comes from the director of The Wedding Planner. So, which is especially odd since there is a pretty crass reference to Jennifer Lopez in the movie. But the thing about this, when you look past that, and the fact that it's a strong story, but it's directed like a TV movie, which is pretty much its main flaw, but everything else is working here enough that that doesn't really matter too much at all, really. Because the interesting thing I felt like this story always did, this is, I guess, my take on it anyway, is that it's clearly, when we set up Landon's character, there's a redemption arc that's brewing, because he starts off and he's here with his douchebag buddies and all that. And I could see this being off-putting. It is off-putting at first, because the douchebags he hangs around with, like that Dean guy, and the guy that's like, that he reads lines with that's like sex-obsessed in a really weird way. The guy that makes the Jennifer Lopez remark. They're like, their douchebaggery is at such cartoonish levels that it's impossible to take them as real people. And it's like, there are comedies. There are comedies that portray douchebags more authentically than this movie does. if you need an example, Peter Facinelli and Can't Hardly Wait. Like that would be much more accurate of a portrayal than the stuff we see in this movie from the characters like Dean or whoever. Um, but the thing here is that this redemption arc is very interesting because the events in it feel like they're reversed. Because typically, when you think of a redemption arc, starting with the way this story starts, when they're hazing the guy, so it's like if you jump off this thing, then you're one of us or whatever the hell they are. It's not like they're a fucking gang. I don't. They're a little friend group or whatever. Um, with an early appearance from Paz de la Huerta, who you might know from Boardwalk Empire, among other things, or Jim Jarmusch movies. But so they have him jump off this thing, and he is like injured, and he's like injured, and I want to say paralyzed. But the thing about that is that Landon does end up saving him by pulling him out of the water, and you would think when you think redemption arc, you would think if he's gonna save a life, it would start with somebody he can't save, and then end with somebody that he can, and it's reversed where his story starts with being able to save a life, and then it ends with him not being able to, which is this really sort of heartbreaking angle, given the fact that it's still very much a redemption thing with the way she makes him a different and significantly better person as the story goes on, to the point that like she goes past even the stuff like talking about how cartoonish his douchebag friends are. The scene when after they've started the whole play thing, and she walks up to him, and she's like, "Hey, so I'll see you tonight, right?" And he says, "In your dreams," and it's like scenes like that in one way don't work because they feel very much like an after-school special about peer pressure. Like they're just so incredibly just yeah, it just doesn't work. But there is another side to that that does work, and that is how strong the character of Jamie is. Because, for starters, it also takes kind of a different approach to what when I was laying out the idea of the story always starts with guy meets girl, but in this case, it's guy always knew girl, just not really closely at all. But they apparently been in the same vicinity since kindergarten, but this is the first time. This is like the closest they've been to each other, like actually speaking to each other when we see them now. And the thing I think that really keeps this entire movie afloat, like I said, the story is in there for sure, but in this, and when you look at the options they had, you can see just how much this movie's quality really rested on the shoulders of Mandy Moore and her performance, because not to be, cruel to another actress, a term I use loosely, apparently Jessica Simpson was the other person that was potentially up to play Jamie. And when you have that in mind, you can see how differently this movie could have been. And how it may not have reached the same impact, really, at all. So, when you look at this, you see that there's something about her that feels really real, because what they could have done here and what she could have done here, and I guess to an extent what the direction could have done, was it could have made her seem like a character that was too perfect, where like she comes from like that church background and she seems to have her life really sorted out, and there's just something, and it's to the point that that's why the other characters like outcast her basically and make fun of her and all that, make fun of her blue sweater or whatever. But the fact that she goes through the movie like not ashamed of herself and not ashamed of her life, especially given what we eventually learn about her, and where this is coming from, there's just such a strength to this character now that takes us through the whole thing, and it's like, and it's so strong that you look at Shane West's character, Landon, where this is the kind of story we were talking about, the redemption arc, but it's like when we see him in like the first half and we see him palling around with the douches, we're like, in another movie, by the time they're doing the play and they kind of start liking each other and all that, would normally be the part where we go, okay, but why in God's name should we care about this guy? Why should we root for him in any capacity whatsoever? All he has done so far is prove that he is a gigantic douchebag. Up to and including the in your dreams thing, which she just very much took in stride. I mean, she got angry, but they're actually playing her as a human character in a movie like this, which is something it feels like we don't see too often. Um, and the fact that how the way in which she eventually gets over that, it just feels true to the character. Like it feels true to her character that she eventually, allows him back in, and then it's like it feels so authentic through her that the reason we don't ask why should we root for him, why should we like him when he's a douchebag, is that we kind of start to like him before we really even realize it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're so comfortable in her character and the way she is and how sure of herself she is, that when she starts to like him, we just kind of maybe even unconsciously start to also, because it's almost like our minds are telling us without even having to think about it. If she's okay with him, then we can be also, and that it's a sign that he truly is changing, and this isn't just a script or a story working its wheels. We're actually getting to that point gradually because of the two characters, and how authentic they are. And in talking of authentic characters, also another character that just could have been a huge cliche is her dad, who is Peter Coyote, who could have been the guy that he could have been John Lithgow in Footloose. But there's something much more, and once again, it starts off, and sort of like with her also in certain instances, it starts off like it's a surface level thing, but then when it's revealed that she has leukemia, then what she and her dad have been doing and the way they've been behaving through the whole movie suddenly makes perfect sense, and we get why they were saying this and why they weren't saying that or whatever. It's like the moment when she says, "You have to do me like one favor, don't fall in love with me," and it's like when you the first time you see it and you don't realize she's actually saying, "Don't fall in love with me because it won't last because I won't last." Um, you almost take it as like it's almost like she's being meta about it and saying like don't fall in love with me because that would be the cliche. But then once it's revealed why she's saying that, then suddenly everything that's been said and done up through the movie suddenly becomes significantly more heartbreaking. And the way they kind of perfectly set that up, it's one of those cases where when you go back and watch it and it's like so blatantly obvious. But if I remember correctly, at the time it came out, especially since people weren't as familiar with Sparks and the way his stories go as they are now, that it was a huge gut punch to a lot of people. That's one of those cases where, unlike Love Story, it still kind of works because we're able to get so attached to her character also. And I think that's another thing is, I think, once again, this is just an opinion thing. I do think the characters in Walk to Remember work a lot more as far as being individual characters. Whereas in Love Story, we do have those moments where like he feels the remorse and he wishes she was there or he runs after her. But they feel much more like they're like sort of one thing, which is nice and romantic to an extent. But it's just significantly more believable and eventually powerful when you sense the characters are two individuals from two totally different places that come together the way that they do. And I said, and obviously it's they come from two different places in Love Story also, but just it almost feels like in an emotional sense it's happening in A Walk to Remember, whereas not so much in Love Story. It's pretty much all about their school backgrounds. Um, and then eventually it gets to the moments where once everything is revealed, then it is going to be a giant pull on your heartstrings relentlessly tearjerker movie, which can obviously often seem forced, especially when you got a director that does it like he's doing a TV movie. But there are still scenes that totally work that may even be seen as corny or cheesy or whatever, like the wedding. But and this is really high praise because I love this scene and it breaks my heart every time in this other movie. The wedding kind of reminds me of the last shot of Titanic, when she's walking down the aisle and everybody that we know is here. Even his dad is up there with him, and it's, yeah. It's like even though it's something we've seen before and it's kind of cheesy and hallmarky, it's really the characters that make it work. That's the strength of characters that matter to you. That it can make anything rise above that and get that emotion out of you. It doesn't. You could almost do anything in this story, and if you don't give a shit about those two, then or even multiple characters. Like I said, you really get to care about her dad also. And so yeah, that's and then of course we reach our inevitable conclusion. But once again, nothing is overblown. In neither movie, or I guess in both movies, we only see the aftermath of the guy kind of going his own way. I do think as far as endings go, Love Story hits it much farther out of the park than A Walk to Remember does, but the the journey there in A Walk to Remember is much more like easy to invest in. I think they're just this may be an age gap also, but it does seem like because we're talking about 1970 versus 2002. Obviously, I may find it easier to relate to 2002 characters that are much closer and have just are in totally different time periods. Even if the early 2000s had some plenty of dated stuff in it as well, like the fact that I just saved this guy's life in the water and he might be paralyzed, but let's have a car chase to what was considered rock music in 2002. It's a little weird as far as the start goes, but yeah, obviously they're both going to have their dated qualities and their cheesy qualities, but they both get there in one way or another. But weirdly enough, despite Love Story's legendary status and its 7 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, Walk to Remember is kind of the one that's always gotten to me a little more, and I think a lot of that is based on Mandy Moore's performance. Not to take away from the Oscar-nominated work of Ryan O'Neal and Ally McGraw, but yeah. So I think that's going to be what this is. I know probably what the next 2 of these are. So we'll see how those go, and then the movies next week. We've got Harrison Ford's new movie and some Netflix stuff and whatever the hell else. So until all of that stuff, I think that's going to be it for this.